In 1906, Teddy Roosevelt is going to sign important legislation for the regulation of big business. For example, he's going to sign the Hepburn Act. What this does is it's going to basically make sure that the railroads don't charge in exorbitant prices. Okay, they have to have a complaint, but once they do have a complaint, the ICC, that Interstate Commerce Commission that we've talked about, can come in and regulate the railroads. Another thing that's going to be passed in 1906 is the Pure Food and Drug Act. Many additives were being put in foods at this time, and they were being exposed by the muckrakers. So Congress passes the Pure Food and Drug Act. It regulated the food and drug industry. This is the origins of the FDA today. It regulated what could and could not be put in the food. The next one, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, came about after Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, comes out. Now, basically, Roosevelt is going to read the book, and he's going to call for an official investigation and try to figure out what the truth was. And it turns out that Upton Sinclair's book was actually the mild version. Rather, what the proof was is the fact that in reality, it was much worse. So what exactly does this scare the bejesus out of Teddy Roosevelt? Allow me to read two passages. The first one I'm going to read, it's going to talk about unsanitary conditions, but I would also like for you to listen to the number of people that are involved here. If you remember in a previous lecture, I talked about the fact that people were becoming dependent. They were losing their sense of individuality, right? So this little passage here is talking about the processing of a hog, a pig, in a meatpacking plant. And listen to the number of people that are involved. It's going to be a little long, so settle in. The carcass hog was scooped out of the vat by machinery, and then it fell onto the second floor, passing on the way through a wonderful machine with numerous scrapers, which adjusted themselves to the size and shape of the animal, and sent it out the other side with nearly all its bristles removed. It was then again strung up by machinery, and sent up upon another trolley ride, this time passing between two lines of men, who sat upon a raised platform, each doing a certain single thing to the carcass as it came to him. One scraped the outside of the leg, another scraped the inside of the leg. One with the swift strokes cut the throat. Another with two swift strokes severed the head, which fell to the floor and vanished through a hole. Another made a slit down the body. A second opened the body wider. A third, with a saw, cut the breastbone. A fourth loosened the entrails. A fifth pulled them out, and they also slid a hole in the floor. There were men to scrape each side and men to scrape the back. There were men to clean the carcass inside, to trim it and wash it. Looking down this room, one saw creeping slowly a line of dangling hogs 100 yards in length, and for every yard there was a man working as if a demon were after him. At the end of the hog's progress, every inch of the carcass had been gone over several times, and then it was rolled into the chilling room, where it stayed for 24 hours, where a stranger might lose himself in a forest of freezing hogs. Now that doesn't sound very disgusting to me, or maybe not to you as well, but what does sound interesting is the fact that, did you count the number of men that were involved? Now, I didn't. I'm a historian. I'm not a mathematician, unfortunately. I'm not very good at counting. But nevertheless, just picture that and compare it to, say, a butcher shop, right? Where they have an individual hog show up in a, very small number of individuals, are going to process the hog. The next portion I want to read is basically it's going to be the gross part. All right, so let's read about what's known as let's see here, as head cheese. Now this one's a little bit longer, so if you excuse me. Jonas, a character in the book, Jonas had told them how the meat was taken out of the pickle, which was often found sour, and how they would rub it with soda to take away the smell, and sell it to be eaten at free lunch counters. Also, of all the miracles of chemistry which they performed, giving to any of the sort of meat, fresh or salted, whole or chopped, any color or any flavor or any odor they chose. they chose. In the pickling of hams, they had an ingenious apparatus by which they saved time and increased the capacity of the plant. A machine consisting of a hollow needle attached to a pump. By plunging this needle into the meat and working with his foot, a man could fill the ham with pickle in a few seconds. And yet, in spite of this, there would be hams found spoiled, some of them with an odor so bad that a man could hardly bear to be in the room with them. To pump into these, the packers had a second and much stronger pickle, which destroyed the odor, a process known to the workers as giving them 30%. Also, after the hams had been smoked, there would have found some that had gone bad. Formerly, these had been sold as number 3 grade, but later on, some ingenious person had hit upon a new device, and now they could extract the bone, about which the bad part generally lay, and insert in the hole a white hot iron. After this invention, there was no longer number 1, number 2, and 3 grade. There was only number 1 grade. The packers were always originating some such schemes. They had what they called boneless hams, which were at all the odds and ends of pork stuffed into casings, and California hams, which were the shoulders with big knuckle joints, and nearly all of the meat cut out, and the fancy skinned hams, which were made of the oldest hogs whose skins were so heavy and coarse that no one would buy them. That is, until they were cooked and chopped up fine and labeled head cheese. You can imagine, therefore, the hysteria that the book would have created. And when they investigated what the claims that were made in the book, they found that actually the truth was worse than fiction. Now, Roosevelt was pleased with what he had accomplished, but called for even more in 1907 and 1908. For example, he called for a federal agency that would regulate all interstate commerce. He also even called for the federal regulation of the stock market. The point is, though, is that Congress would not give him the things he wanted in 1907 and 1908. The main reason is because he's splitting the party. Some people are saying he's going too far, too fast. Roosevelt is in danger of splitting his own party. His brand of progressivism was leading some Republicans to become more progressive, while causing others to step back and say, wait a minute, this is too much. There's just one other area that Roosevelt was able to do things as far as regulation goes. That is the area of conservationism, of the conservation of America's natural resources. Roosevelt studied the natural resources and the natural sciences, and he was extremely interested in conservation. One concrete example of this goes back in the 1890s, when Congress passed a law that allowed the president to put unsold public land into reserve and call it various things like national parks, wildlife refuges, etc. When it put it into reserve, it basically closed it off to sale, and they would use it and regulate it with the federal government. The point is, the act passes in 1891, and by 1901, there's like 45 million acres put into reserve. Now, when Roosevelt gets a hold of it, Roosevelt, in his terms, brings it up to 150 million acres of forest into reserve, 3 times as much as presidents 10 years before them. The point is, Roosevelt really pushes conservationism and puts it into land reform and into reserve. A lot of this land is put into reserve under the Forestry Service and done by a good friend of his right-hand man, Gifford Pinchot. We're going to remember Gifford Pinchot, particularly when we get to the William Howard Taft administration. But nevertheless, by 1907, Congress is saying too much. Too much land is being put into reserve, and under pressure by timber companies and whatnot, Congress is going to put a rider on top of the forestry bill, basically an add-on to the Forestry Service's budget bill. Thus, if Roosevelt vetoed the bill, he would be vetoing the money needed for conservation. Now, Roosevelt had 10 days to sign it or veto it, and by the time it got to his desk. So Roosevelt takes those 10 days, rallies his supporters, and puts 17 million more acres into government reserves. He took 2,500 water tower sites and designated them ranger stations, for example. This is the kind of thing that Roosevelt loved to do.